have been here all day if we talked about all the coordinating. But if your brain can do that and you barely have to think about it in a split second, what is your brain actually capable of if you put your mind to it? That's what we have to really begin to think about. And, you know, what we do with our brain is like what we do with a computer. If you put a lot of information into it and you program it correctly, it does a lot of things for you. You know, after I got on the right track, one of the TV programs I was allowed to watch was GE College Bowl. Now, most of you are too young to remember that program, but it came on every Sunday, and they had two colleges pitted against each other. And they would ask questions about science and math and history and geography, and I was really good at all that stuff. I wanted to be a contestant on that show. But they would also ask questions about classical art and classical music. There was no way you were learning anything about that at Southwestern High School in inner city Detroit. I mean, at my high school, if you said something about Van Gogh, they would have said, put gas in it, the van will go. I don't know what you were talking about. So I made it my personal goal to learn all this stuff. I would get on the bus and go downtown to the Detroit Institute of Art, day after day, week after week, month after month, roam to those galleries until I knew every picture, who painted, when they were born, when they died, what period it represented, listening to my portable radio, Bach, Telemann, Mozart. Kids in Detroit thought I was nuts. A black kid in Motown listening to Mozart? I tried to convince him that the Mo in Motown was Mozart, but nobody was buying it. And I even decided which college I was going to apply to, because I had enough money to apply to one college. I said, I'm applying to the college that wins the grand championship of College Bowl. Well, the grand championship that year was between Harvard and Yale. And Yale demolished Harvard. So I didn't want to go to school with a bunch of dummies. So I applied to Yale. Unfortunately, they accepted me with a scholarship. And I was gung-ho. But the year I went there was the year College Bowl went off the air. I know it's a sad story. But it had a happy ending, because that's where I met my wife, Candy, and we've been married for 50 years. But being successful really requires not being afraid. You know, fear can really change a person's life and a person's accomplishments. For instance, when I was a kid, I was afraid of dogs. And it changed my life. Every time I went outside, first thing I had to do was look around and see if there was a dog. I'd be going to school. I'd almost be there, and there'd be a dog. And I'd have to turn around and go all the way around the block and come back in the other direction. And there'd be another dog. And I'd be late to school. And the teachers were always on my case. And then I met a man. I was 8 years old, and he told me something that changed my life. He said, Benny, if you act like you're not afraid of a dog, they won't bother you. He said, no matter how big and ferocious they are, if they don't think you're afraid of them, they won't bother you. I said, are you sure about this? He said, absolutely, you can bet on it. Well, there was this real mean dog down the street named Rusty. Nobody liked to go down that way because of Rusty. I said, I'm going to test this out. So I go strolling down there confidently, and Rusty sees me, and his ears perk up, and he comes charging, barking and snarling, and runs right up to my leg. And I said, this was a mistake. And he just sniffed my leg, turned around and went back to the porch and laid down. You know, that was the last time Rusty ever came after me. He would go after other people, but he wouldn't bother me because I wasn't afraid of him. And think about how that affects our lives. Fear, sometimes it keeps us from capitalizing on wonderful opportunities. For instance, when I was chief resident at Johns Hopkins, we had the grand opening of the Neuroscience Center. And since Hopkins is the modern birthplace for neurosurgery, all the bigwigs from around the world were there, including one of the bigwigs from Australia. And he took a liking to me, and he said, "You should come to Australia to be the senior registrar at the major teaching hospital in Western Australia." And I said, "Australia? You gotta be kidding me." That's how, I didn't say that out loud, but that's what I was thinking. I mean, you drill a hole from Baltimore, you come out in Australia. And plus, I had heard they had a whites-only policy. So I wasn't really too interested in that. But it seemed like every time we turned around, there was somebody saying, "Good eye, Mike, how you going?" Just kept running to Australians everywhere.
Wow.
Every time we turned the TV on, there was a special about Australia. And I said to Candy, "I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia." And she did some investigating, some research, discovered that they did have the whites-only policy, but it was an unofficial policy that had officially been abolished in 1968. And this was 1983. So we sold all of our earthly belongings and off we went to Australia. And our friends were saying, "You'll be back in 3 weeks." But little did they know, we didn't have any more money, so we wouldn't come back. But you know, the biggest problem in Australia was dealing with all the dinner invitations. Everybody wanted you to come to dinner. They just wanted to hear your accent.
That's funny.
I would say, "Excuse me, I'm the American, you guys have the accent." But the second biggest problem was every time I sat down and started writing in a chart, invariably somebody would come along and say, "Do you mind if I feel your hair?" I said, "You can feel it, but it's going to cost you $10. And I used to say to the Aussies, "I can't remember any of your names because you all look alike." But you know, it turned out to be one of the very best moves I ever made, because in all of Western Australia, there are only 4 neurosurgical attendings. And once they discovered that I could operate, they kind of left me in charge of the major teaching hospital, and they went out to the private hospitals. And I was doing 3 or 4 major craniotomies every day, very complex surgeries. And if I had stayed on at Hopkins, I would have been this low man on the totem pole, got to do what nobody else wanted to do. It would have taken me many years to get that kind of experience. So when I came back after 1 year, the position of director of pediatric neurosurgery opened up. And normally they'd go out and get somebody with a lot of gray hair and a big name. They said, "Carson's only 33, but he can do everything." And that's how I got to be chief at such a young age. But I'll tell you something, the Lord always prepares you for what he wants you to do. You never have to worry about that. And I started doing all kinds of cases. And some people would say, "Carson's a hot dog. You know, he'll do anything." But it's not true. I actually had a formula for what I would do. It's called a BWA, a best worst analysis. I would ask 4 critical questions. What's the best thing that happens if I do this? What's the worst thing that happens if I do this? What's the best thing that happens if I don't do this? What's the worst thing that happens if I don't do this? And by answering those questions and analyzing those answers, you generally will move in the right direction. That goes for surgery. That goes for any type of endeavor. Asking those questions. And so many times people do things half-cocked without really thinking them through. If they had just spent that little bit of extra effort, it would have made all the difference in the world. But things don't always work out the way we want them to either. There was a case in South Africa, conjoined twins. They were joined at the back of the head, like the first set that we had done that brought so much acclaim. But they were deteriorating so rapidly that I was asked to come on an urgent basis to help separate them. They weren't sure why they were deteriorating so rapidly. And we used a technique that we used with the German twins called hypothermic arrest, where you cool the body temperature until the heart stops, pump all the blood out, and you can operate for up to an hour before you have to restore the blood flow and start the heart back up. But when we exposed the heart of one of those twins, it wasn't functioning. It was just fibrillating. And it became clear that the reason that they were deteriorating so rapidly is because the one was doing the pumping for both of them. And as they were growing, that became increasingly difficult to do, went to congestive failure. So obviously we completed the operation. That twin with no heart function was not viable, but the other one was doing quite well. We were pleased with that for a day. And then that one started having seizures and all kinds of metabolic problems and died. And the autopsy revealed that that one had no kidneys because the other one had the kidney function. So one had the kidney function and one had the heart function. They couldn't live together, they couldn't live apart. But I was devastated. I was thinking, I didn't have to come over here to fail. We had put together this incredible team, international team, to do the operation. People had donated amazing equipment from all over the world. We were all set to do this fabulous operation in South Africa. And I was really bummed out. But interestingly enough, 2 years later, there was another case in Zambia, type 2 vertical craniopagus. They were joined at the top of the head facing an opposite direction. There have been 13 attempts to separate twins of that type before, none of which had been successful. And I went over to help with that case. I remember going to the operating room and there was a big sign that said, "God bless Joseph and Luca Banda." And they were having song service and prayer service, and I was thrilled. But 19 hours into the operation, the vessels were so complex, it looked like a bowl of spaghetti. Trying to figure out which ones went where, and we stopped the operation. And I said, maybe if we cover the area over with skin and keep them attached, but we put a little traction on it, the vessels will separate themselves out over the course of a few months and we can come back and complete the operation. And the doctors from Zambia and South Africa said, that's a great idea. And I know it would work at Johns Hopkins, but we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. Now I really felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't have all my fancy equipment that we have at Hopkins. And I went back in that room with a prayer on my lips and started operating for the next several hours. I honestly don't remember all the things that I did, but one of the other neurosurgeons was telling me sometime afterwards, we couldn't believe what you were doing. But when I made the cut that finally separated those two twins over the stereo system came the Hallelujah chorus. And everybody had goosebumps And when we finished that operation after 28 hours, one of the twins opened his eyes, reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing by the time they got to the ICU. Within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 3 days, they were eating. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling. And today, they are perfectly normal adults. And that is the first time complexly joined craniophagus twins have not only survived, but been neurologically normal. But that couldn't have happened without the failure in the first case. And I say that to say that just because you have a failure doesn't mean that you have to continue down that road if you learn from that failure. Every time you learn something new, it makes an incredible difference in what's going on. Now, one of the things that I learned is to be perceptive and to understand the environment in which you live. And one of the things that led me to develop the American Cornerstone Institute is recognizing that the environment that we face in our country is becoming toxic. There are people who want to fundamentally change who we are. And some people say this is all of recent origin. It is not of recent origin. In fact, if you go back and you look at the congressional record, January the 10th, 1963, 62 years ago, Congressman Herlong of Florida read into the congressional record the 45 goals of communism in America. There were things like gaining control of the public schools and the teacher unions so you could indoctrinate the kids, gaining control of television, news, and Hollywood so that you could change the culture of America, making sexual perversion normal, natural, and healthy, denigrating the role of fathers in the family, denigrating the role of families, elevating the role of government, taking the church and making the real gospel the social gospel. And on it goes as you read through them and you begin to understand what's happening in our country. And I want people to understand that we, the American people, are not each other's enemies. There are those who are trying to stir the pot on the basis of race, age, income, gender, political affiliation, religion, you name it, divide and conquer. And they've succeeded to a large degree of making people think that they should hate each other because your neighbor has a different yard sign. Well, you know, I always say if two people think the same about everything, one of them isn't necessary. You know, we need to do everything we can to resist that kind of foolishness. And one exercise that I highly recommend for people is with your family, just get together and make a pledge that you're going to be nice to everyone you encounter for 24 hours. Just sometimes that's a challenge because some people are really hard to be nice to. But practice makes perfect. And when you can do it for 24 hours, you can do it for 48 hours. You can do it for 72 hours. You can do it for 168 hours. you can make it a part of who you are. And we can begin to change the society. We don't have to listen to the purveyors of hatred. We are not enemies. Take the first letter of each one of those. W-A-N-E, wane. We've let hatred and division wax for a long time. Now it's time to let it wane and change who we are. And we can do that. And we think about the rich history of our country. Now there are some people say, no, our country doesn't have a rich history because we've had slavery in our country. We've had unfairness to people. We've had internment camps. Guess what? There is no society historically that hasn't had to deal with slavery. So that does not make the United States of America unique. What does make us unique is that we had so many people who were vehemently opposed to it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population to get rid of the evil institution. That's what we need to teach our children. The positive aspects. We need to teach them the good, the bad, and the ugly. But there's a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And we need to focus on that. We need to focus on the opportunities that exist in a country like this. I was talking to a lady from Ethiopia recently, a very successful businesswoman in this country. And I said, I noticed that just about everybody I meet from Ethiopia is extremely successful. Why is that? And she said, because in the country that I came from, there's not a lot of opportunity. And when we come to America and we look around and we see nothing but opportunity. But a lot of the people who are born here don't seem to see the opportunity. And that we each have a sphere of influence. And we can use that sphere of influence in a very positive way to encourage all of those people who are around us to once again look at what's going on, take advantage of it, make that life for yourself. You know, I hated poverty when I was growing up. Some people hate snakes and roaches and rats. I hated poverty. I couldn't stand it. That is, until my mother made me start reading those books. And as I read about entrepreneurs and engineers and explorers and inventors, and I began to recognize that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you is you. Amen. It's not somebody else, it's not some circumstance. And I realized that I could change my economic situation. I didn't have to wait for somebody else or depend on what somebody else did. And at that point, poverty didn't bother me anymore because I knew it was only temporary. There you go. That is an incredible blessing that we have in our country. And we need to be ambassadors of hope. Also, we need to be courageous. We face situations sometimes that are scary. I remember there was a case of a young man who had been Hippo-Lindau disease. This is a disease in which you develop these very vascular tumors in the central nervous system. And he developed one in his brainstem, right in the middle of his pons, an area that's considered inoperable. It's like a coaxial cable. Everything is vitally important. And none of the adult neurosurgeons would touch him with a 10-foot pole. Unfortunately for me, his wife was a pediatric neurosurgery nurse who worked on the floor where most of my patients were. So I couldn't escape her. And she said, "You're going to have to operate on my husband." I said, "But I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon." And she said, he acts like a child. And she just kept after me, and I finally said, okay, I'll go and talk to him. And I said, Craig, you know, if I take you to the operating room, there's at least a 50-50 chance that you will die on the table. And he said, Doc, if you don't take me to the operating room, there's a 100% chance that I'm gonna die. So what do I have to lose? And I thought that was a pretty mature attitude. Took him to the operating room, and he had grown all these new blood vessels into the area. It was a very difficult operation, but under a high-powered microscope, it made a tiny hole in the brainstem and took a little micro probe and felt around until I felt the consistency changed, and I knew that that was the tumor. Put some little micro forceps in to grab it and start pulling it out and teasing the tissues away from it. And then the evoked potentials went flat. The electrical waves that indicate brain activity went flat. And the anesthesiologist, who had been vehemently opposed to the operation, said, I told you were going to kill him. And,
Wow.
you know, we were not happy. But got the tumor out, closed him up. Of course, he had no neurological function, went to the ICU on full life support. And his wife and I prayed that night. When I came in the next morning, he had been extubated and was sitting up in the bed telling jokes. So pretty amazing. That courage, the courage to do that, comes from doing that BWA and for seeking wisdom from God.
Amen.
And what we need to recognize is that we live in a fantastic country, and the reason it's so fantastic is because many people have sacrificed for us. I want you to think about World War II. Think about all those young women who went into the munitions factories and were blown to bits. Did that stop them? It did not. They made more airplanes and mortars than anybody could imagine to support the war effort. Think about the young men, 15, 16, 17 years old, who lied about their age so that they could fight for our country.
Like my dad.
Think about D-Day as they're approaching the shores of Normandy under heavy machine gun fire. 100 dead soldiers laying dead in the sand. 1,000 dead soldiers laying dead in the sand. Were the others afraid? Did they turn back?
No.
Yes, they were afraid. No, they didn't turn back. They stepped over the dead bodies and they overwhelmed the Axis forces, knowing in many cases they would never see their loved ones or their homeland again. Why? Why did they do that? Obviously not for themselves, but for you and for me, so that we could live in peace and freedom. And now it's our turn to be brave and to recognize that you cannot be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. Thank you so much.